The moment 12-year-old Grace Carter heard the two security guards whispering in fluent Chinese, every drop of color drained from her face. She wasn't supposed to understand a single word. To everyone around her, she was just a quiet girl waiting outside a towering office building in downtown Seattle, Washington, while her grandmother finished cleaning offices inside. But years earlier, Grace's missionary parents had spent several years serving in Taiwan before their tragic accident, and Chinese had become as natural to her as English. What the guards said next made her heart stop. They calmly discussed how the billionaire should enter the black limousine because everything was already prepared, and within minutes, no one would suspect what had happened. Grace realized she had only seconds to decide whether to stay silent or risk everything to save a complete stranger. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, courage, and second chances can change lives, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more heart-touching stories like this every week. Grace had never imagined that understanding a language few people around her knew would become the difference between life and death. Ever since losing her parents at the age of 7, she had lived with her elderly grandmother, Margaret Carter, who worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep food on their small apartment table. Money was always tight. Their apartment had peeling paint, old furniture, and a heater that barely worked during Washington's rainy winters. Grace never complained because she knew every dollar her grandmother earned came from aching hands and sleepless nights. Every afternoon after school, Grace waited patiently outside the corporate headquarters where Margaret cleaned executive offices. She usually spent the time reading library books or doing homework while executives rushed past without ever noticing the little girl sitting quietly near the entrance. That afternoon seemed perfectly ordinary until 2 men wearing expensive security uniforms stepped near the revolving entrance. They looked professional, confident, and calm. To everyone else, they appeared to be discussing routine work. But Grace instantly recognized their Mandarin conversation. At first she ignored them, assuming they were simply chatting privately. Then one sentence froze her entire body. One man quietly confirmed that the explosive device had already been attached beneath the billionaire's armored limousine, and that the remote detonator would only be activated after the vehicle reached the highway, ensuring no one nearby would be harmed and suspicion would fall elsewhere. The second man laughed softly and replied that after today, millions of dollars would finally belong to the people who hired them. Grace's hands began trembling so violently that her school notebook slipped from her lap. She looked around desperately. Hundreds of people moved in every direction. Business executives answered phones. Employees hurried toward parking garages. Delivery drivers unloaded packages. Nobody noticed 2 guards speaking another language. Nobody except Grace. For several terrifying seconds, she wondered if she had misunderstood something. She replayed every word in her mind. No, she had understood perfectly. The danger was real. The billionaire they were discussing was Michael Anderson, founder of one of America's largest cybersecurity companies. Newspapers often described him as brilliant but distant. Television interviews showed a wealthy businessman surrounded by expensive suits, luxury cars, and private security. Grace knew almost nothing about him except that he owned the building where her grandmother worked. Then the front doors opened. Michael Anderson stepped outside surrounded by assistants and several security officers. Grace felt panic tightening around her chest. If she shouted, would anyone believe a frightened little girl? If she stayed silent, an innocent man might die. Before fear could stop her, Grace ran. She squeezed past surprised employees and rushed directly toward the billionaire just as he approached the waiting limousine. Her small voice cracked with desperation as she begged him not to get into the car. Everyone stared. Security immediately grabbed Grace by the shoulders, assuming she was simply another child who had wandered too close. Michael looked confused more than frightened. One guard demanded to know why she was causing trouble. Grace struggled to explain between frightened breaths that the 2 guards near the entrance had been speaking Chinese about a bomb beneath the limousine. The surrounding crowd erupted into nervous laughter. Someone muttered that children often imagined strange stories. Another security supervisor insisted none of his personnel even spoke Chinese. Grace desperately pointed toward the 2 men she had overheard. But the moment everyone turned, the guards were gone. The disappearance changed everything. Michael's longtime head of security suddenly became alert. Experienced professionals knew innocent employees rarely vanished the instant accusations were made against them. He immediately ordered every vehicle stopped and instructed bomb technicians to inspect the limousine. The next several minutes felt like hours. Grace stood shaking beside her grandmother, who had rushed outside after hearing the commotion. Margaret held her granddaughter close, silently praying that Grace hadn't misunderstood what she'd heard. Then one technician slowly crawled out from beneath the limousine. His face had turned pale. Carefully carried inside a protective container was an explosive device powerful enough to destroy the entire vehicle. The crowd fell completely silent. Michael stared at Grace in disbelief. The little girl everyone had dismissed had just saved his life. Police quickly sealed the entire area while federal investigators arrived. Surveillance footage revealed that two fake security guards had entered using expertly forged credentials. They had disappeared only moments before Grace spoke up. Investigators later discovered they belonged to an international criminal network responsible for multiple assassination attempts involving wealthy executives across North America. News of the incident spread rapidly across every major television network in the United States. Reporters praised the anonymous girl who understood a language no one expected her to know. Yet Grace returned home that evening to the same tiny apartment with leaking windows and overdue utility bills. Life didn't magically become easier. Michael couldn't stop thinking about the frightened child who had risked her own safety without expecting anything in return. Most adults might have remained silent, fearing embarrassment or retaliation. Grace had chosen courage instead. Several days later, Michael visited the apartment personally. He was shocked. The family who had saved his life lived with almost nothing. Margaret apologized repeatedly for the condition of their home, embarrassed by the worn furniture and outdated kitchen. Michael noticed schoolbooks stacked neatly despite broken shelves. He saw Grace studying beside a lamp held together with tape. Nothing in the apartment reflected self-pity. It reflected dignity despite hardship. Michael asked Grace one simple question. Why had she risked herself for someone she'd never met? Grace quietly explained that her parents had taught her one lesson before they died. If God ever gave her the chance to protect another person, she should never ignore it because every life mattered equally, whether rich or poor. Those words remained with Michael long after he left. For years, success had filled his calendar but emptied his personal life. He had spent decades building a billion-dollar company while losing touch with simple human compassion. Grace reminded him of the values he once believed in before ambition consumed everything. Within weeks, Michael quietly established a scholarship fund covering every educational expense Grace would ever have. He also ensured Margaret could retire comfortably without worrying about rent or medical bills. But he made one condition absolutely clear. None of it was payment for saving his life. It was an investment in people whose character had already proven priceless. Grace continued attending public school like every other student. She never became arrogant or entitled. Her classmates eventually learned about the famous incident. Yet she remained the same humble girl who helped struggling students with homework and volunteered at local food banks every weekend. Years passed. Grace graduated as one of Washington State's top students before earning admission to Georgetown University, where she studied international relations and cybersecurity languages. Her unusual childhood experiences inspired her to help law enforcement identify international criminal organizations that often hid behind language barriers. Meanwhile, Michael transformed his company culture. Employee assistance programs expanded dramatically. Custodial workers received better wages and healthcare benefits. Scholarships were created for children of every maintenance employee across the company. Executives questioned why the billionaire suddenly cared so deeply about families most corporations overlooked. Michael always gave the same answer. The strongest person I ever met carried a backpack instead of a briefcase. He never forgot. Neither did Grace. On the 20th anniversary of that extraordinary afternoon, Michael invited hundreds of employees, community leaders, and law enforcement officers to a special ceremony outside the very building where everything had happened. Standing beside him was Dr. Grace Carter, now an internationally respected expert who helped prevent global security threats through language intelligence. The crowd applauded for several minutes. But Grace gently reminded everyone that countless acts of courage happen every day without television cameras. Teachers protecting students. Parents sacrificing for children. workers doing honest jobs nobody notices, grandparents raising families after heartbreaking loss. She insisted her grandmother deserved more recognition than she ever would because Margaret had taught her that true courage begins long before dramatic moments arrive. It begins through ordinary kindness practiced every single day. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as the audience stood together in heartfelt applause. Michael quietly realized that the greatest fortune he had ever received wasn't measured in dollars. It was the chance to live long enough to become a better man. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes good people exist, subscribe to the channel, and tell us your thoughts below. Your support encourages us to keep sharing stories that inspire hope, courage, and compassion. Special request: before you leave, please comment with the words, "One act of courage can change a lifetime." As the ceremony ended, Grace looked toward the same entrance where she had once sat alone with a worn library book, unnoticed by the busy world rushing past. She smiled, remembering that extraordinary destinies often begin with ordinary people making one impossible decision. On that rainy afternoon in Seattle, a little girl with nothing but courage and a forgotten language saved a billionaire's life. Yet in the years that followed, it became clear that the billionaire hadn't been the only one rescued. Grace had also saved a lonely man's heart, restored hope to countless struggling families, and proved that true greatness is never determined by wealth, status, or power. It is measured by the quiet courage to do what is right, even when no one believes you, because sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest miracle.